The clock above the grand corridor at Buckingham Palace struck 11:30, but the sound was muffled, as if the very walls understood that this was no ordinary morning. For the first time in 70 years, the private study of the late Queen Elizabeth II was not her own. Instead, it had been transformed into a chamber of legal finality. A single leather-bound document, sealed with red wax, bearing the cipher of a monarch who no longer reigned, lay upon the mahogany desk. Around it, the surviving senior members of the House of Windsor had gathered, not as a family, but as beneficiaries bound by duty and suspicion. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and newer grief. But it was not King Charles III, the sovereign, who held the floor. It was Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, disgraced, sidelined, yet inexplicably holding the keys to his mother's last testament. The reason for his appointment as the reader was a technicality buried in a codicil from 2009. The late Queen had stipulated that the will's first reading be witnessed by the most senior non-reigning male heir. That man, by a twist of lineage and longevity, was Andrew, and as he broke the seal with trembling, pallid fingers, the entire machinery of the British monarchy held its breath. Andrew's voice, once confident and booming during his years as a naval officer and trade envoy, was now a hoarse whisper. He adjusted his spectacles, a gesture so oddly human that it momentarily disarmed the hostility in the room. "This is the last will and testament of me, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor," he began. King Charles, seated directly opposite, did not look at his brother. His gaze was fixed on a portrait of his mother that hung above the fireplace, as if seeking posthumous guidance. Queen Camilla beside him kept her hands perfectly still, though her rings seemed to dig into her fingers. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, leaned forward, his blue eyes sharp and analytical, already cataloging the potential political fallout of every word. Behind him, standing against the bookshelves like sentinels, were Princess and Prince Edward. Their faces were masks, but their postures told a different story. Anne's arms were crossed, a fortress of self-control. Edward's hands were clasped in front of him, knuckles white. The Duchess of Edinburgh, Sophie, watched Andrew with an expression of deep, unreadable pity. Only one chair was empty, the one that might have been for the Duke of Sussex, who, despite the Queen's invitation in her final months, remained thousands of miles away in California, a ghost at the feast. The first pages were standard, a formality that did little to ease the tension. The Queen left the bulk of her personal estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, to Charles, as was tradition. She left her racing stock too, and a deeply personal bequest that recognized their shared love of horses. For Edward, she left the Royal Lodge at Windsor, a gesture of gratitude for his quiet, steadfast work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award. Then Andrew cleared his throat, and the tone shifted. "To my son, Andrew," he read, pausing as if the paper had burned him. "I leave the private island of Mustique in its entirety with the condition that he use it not as a retreat from duty, but as a place to rebuild the charitable works he once championed, far from the glare of the British press." The silence that followed was volcanic. William's jaw tightened, and uncrossed her arms. Mustique was not merely a vacation home. It was a symbol of escape, of the very life Andrew had been accused of leading at the expense of his public role. The bequest was not a gift. It was an exile wrapped in velvet. Andrew himself looked as if he had been slapped. He had expected cash or perhaps a painting, but his mother, in her infinite strategic wisdom, had given him a golden cage on the other side of the Atlantic. Charles allowed himself the faintest smile, a flicker that vanished as quickly as it appeared. The Queen was still ruling from the grave. It was the next section, however, that made the chandeliers seem to dim. Andrew turned the page, and his voice cracked. "Regarding the future of the Crown estates and the personal fortune amassed during my reign," he read, "I have chosen to depart from precedent. The Balmoral estate, including Birkhall, shall not pass automatically to the sovereign. Instead, it shall be held in a new family trust, overseen by my daughter and the Princess Royal, with a life interest granted to my son, Charles, so long as he maintains the estate's public opening to Scottish citizens." And stoic mask slipped. She blinked twice, rapidly. This was not just a property transfer, it was a constitutional earthquake. For 1,000 years, the monarch's private homes had descended with the crown. The Queen had just severed that link, making Balmoral a quasi-public trust. She was ensuring that the Scottish retreat could never be sold or closed to the people. But there was a deeper, more brutal message embedded in the clause. She had bypassed her male heirs and put her daughter in charge. It was a direct rebuke to the fraternal squabbles she had witnessed between Charles Andrew and Edward over the decades. And the most hard-working and least dramatic of her children was now the gatekeeper of the family's sanctuary. Charles's knuckles went white on the armrest. He had spent years restoring Birkhall, and now he was a tenant in his own home, subject to his sister's oversight. William exchanged a glance with his father, a silent conversation of shock, and perhaps a grudging respect for their grandmother's cunning. Then came the clause that truly made Buckingham Palace tremble. It was not about money or land. It was about the truth. Andrew, his face now ashen, read slowly, "I direct that the letters, diaries, and private correspondence held in the Royal Archives at Windsor relating to the years 1986 to 2002 be released in their entirety to the public on the 10th anniversary of my death. No redactions, no exceptions. The people have a right to understand the decisions made in their name, even those that bring pain to my family." A collective gasp, sharp and involuntary, escaped from someone, perhaps Sophie, perhaps a footman stationed by the door. This was the Queen's final act of radical transparency. For decades, the Royal Archives had been a fortress of discretion, hiding the truth behind the Crown's public face. By ordering an unredacted release, Elizabeth II was doing what no monarch had ever dared. She was subjecting her own reign, her own mistakes, and the scandals of her children to the cold light of historical judgment. This clause was aimed directly at Andrew himself, but also at Charles's messy divorce from Diana, and at the very institution of secrecy that had protected the monarchy for centuries. It was the ultimate abdication of control, a confession that the only way to save the crown was to stop hiding. William looked physically ill. He had spent his entire adult life trying to modernize the monarchy from the outside. His grandmother had just dynamited the foundations from the inside. The room erupted into a chaos of whispered arguments. Charles stood up, his voice rising in a way the public had never heard. "This is madness," he hissed, forgetting his regal composure. "She was unwell when she signed this. It violates the principle of sovereign privacy," and, however, remained seated, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "She was not unwell, Charles. She was lucid. I was there," she said, and I quote, "The only thing that destroys a family is the rot of secrets. Let them see. If they still love us after the truth, then we deserve to survive." Andrew, still holding the will, looked like a man watching his own funeral. He knew what was in those archives. He knew that the coming release would ignite scandals far beyond the ones that had already ruined him. He had been asked to read his own death warrant. The irony was not lost on anyone. Sophie reached out and put a gentle hand on Edward's arm, grounding him. The Duke of Edinburgh looked at his wife, then at his siblings, and for the first time he spoke. "She's right," Edward said, quietly. "We've been lying for too long. Not about everything, but enough. Enough that the truth is the only weapon we have left." But the will was not finished. Andrew, his duty bound by the legal oath he had sworn, continued to read, though his voice was now barely a whisper. There was a codicil regarding the Prince of Wales's private estate, the Duchy of Cornwall. The Queen had placed a restriction on its future use. No funds from the duchy shall be used to settle legal disputes arising from the private actions of any heir, past or present. This was a direct, posthumous shot across the bow at Prince Harry and Meghan, who had relied on Charles's duchy funds for their initial security and legal fees after stepping back. It was also a warning to William. The Crown's money was not a slush fund for personal wars. But the most devastating paragraph was saved for last. Andrew turned the final page, and his eyes widened. He stopped reading. "Go on," Charles demanded, his voice cold. Andrew shook his head, mute. and snatched the paper from his trembling hands and read aloud. Should my son, Andrew, seek to contest any aspect of this will, or should he engage in any public interview, memoir, or documentary regarding my reign without the explicit written consent of the sovereign, the bequest of Mustique shall be void, and in its place he shall receive the sum of £1 to be collected in person at the Windsor Post Office, and his right to the style of His Royal Highness shall be permanently revoked to pass to his ex-wife, Sarah, for the duration of her natural life. The cruelty was surgical. The Queen had not just disinherited Andrew. She had designed a punishment that was both financially humiliating and emotionally precise. Giving his HRH style to Sarah, the woman he had divorced but never stopped loving, was a stroke of psychological genius. It forced him to choose between his pride and his fortune, and the requirement to collect a single pound in person at a public post office was a deliberate, almost Dickensian humiliation designed to be photographed and mocked by the tabloids. Andrew slumped in his chair. He had come into the room hoping for a final gift of love from his mother. He was leaving with a contract of restraint. The palace walls, built to withstand bombs and blitzes, suddenly felt like they were closing in. Outside, the tourists snapping photos of the balcony had no idea that the institution they were staring at had just been fundamentally rewritten by a dead woman's pen. The trembling was no longer metaphorical. Andrew's hands shook so badly that they will slip to the floor, landing at the feet of his brother, the king. Charles bent down, picked up the document, and for a long moment he simply held it. The anger on his face had softened into something far more complex, respect. She played the long game, he said. Finally, she always did. He looked at Andrew, not with pity, but with the weary acceptance of a brother who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom that was also a prison. You will not contest this, Charles said. It was not a question. Andrew nodded. Once, the fight had gone out of him. The Queen, in her final act, had achieved what decades of scandal and legal battles could not. She had rendered Andrew silent. She had forced Charles to be a manager rather than a monarch. And she had placed, and as the guardian of the family's soul, William, watching the dynamic shift in real time, realized that his grandmother had just handed him the blueprint for his own future reign. Transparency, accountability, and the ruthless distribution of power away from a sovereign's sole grip. She had not written a will. She had written a constitution for the modern House of Windsor. The official reading concluded 40 minutes later, but the aftershocks were immediate. Within hours, a senior palace source, almost certainly, and leaked the broad strokes of the transparency clause to the Times. The reaction was global. Pundits called it the most revolutionary act of any British monarch since the Magna Carta. Constitutional experts debated whether a monarch could legally bind their successor in such a way. But the late Queen had been clever. She had used the language of request and moral direction, not absolute decree. She had left Charles the room to disobey, but at the cost of violating her dying wish. The psychological trap was perfect. To break the will was to break faith with the nation's beloved grandmother. Charles, a man who had spent 70 years waiting to be king, found himself trapped by the very love the public held for his mother. He had no choice but to comply. And so, the archives were dated. The countdown to the release of the letters began. In California, Harry reportedly watched the news coverage in silence, then placed a call to his father, the first in 6 months. He asked not about money or titles, but about the letters. Does she mention my mother? He asked. Charles, for once, told him the truth. She mentions everything, and no one is safe. That night, after the lawyers had left and the family had dispersed to their separate wings of the palace, Andrew sat alone in his private sitting room. The lights were off. The only illumination came from the London skyline, filtering through the heavy curtains. On the table before him was a single photograph, the Queen, young and vibrant, holding a baby Andrew in her arms at Balmoral. He picked up his phone. He had a draft of a statement, one that would announce his permanent move to Mustique, his withdrawal from all public life, and his acceptance of the will's terms. His finger hovered over the send button. He thought of the pound coin he would have to collect. He thought of Sarah, who would now outrank him in style, if not in blood. He thought of his mother's face in the photograph, the love that had once been unconditional, now conditional on his silence. He pressed send. In the silent corridors of Buckingham Palace, the tremors began to subside. But the ground had permanently shifted. The Queen's will had done what no living prime minister, no court case, and no public outcry had ever achieved. It had forced the royals to confront the one thing they feared most, not republicanism, not scandal, but the unvarnished truth of their own history. And as the clock struck midnight, a footman walking past the late Queen's study swore he heard the faint sound of a woman laughing. It was, he later told the tabloids, a warm Scottish laugh. The kind that wins arguments without saying a word. The tremors were over. The rebuilding had just begun. And in Windsor, in a locked vault, the countdown to the truth had started ticking. 10 years. The family had a decade to prepare for a storm of their own making. Whether they would use that time to heal or to hide was a question only the living could answer. The dead, as Elizabeth had just proven, had already said their piece.